The crack of gunfire echoed through the frozen Wyoming wilderness, sending a flock of startled crows into the pale winter sky as Abigail Harlow frantically urged her exhausted mare through knee-deep snow. The biting December wind of 1885 tore through her woolen coat, but fear rather than cold caused her violent trembling as she glanced over her shoulder at the three mounted men gaining ground behind her. "There she is," shouted the lead pursuer, a burly man with a scar slashing across his weathered face. "Don't let her reach town." Abigail's mare stumbled in the deep drift, nearly sending her tumbling. They had been chasing her for miles, ever since she'd fled the isolated cabin where they'd cornered her. Her lungs burned from the frigid air, each desperate breath like swallowing glass. The trees around her grew sparser as the forest gave way to an open meadow blanketed in pristine white, beautiful in its serenity, but offering nowhere to hide. "Please," she whispered to her struggling horse, "just a little further." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder behind her. Her mare, pushed beyond endurance, slowed despite Abigail's desperate urging. A bullet whistled past her ear, too close for comfort. She knew they weren't trying to kill her. They needed her alive to force her to reveal where she'd hidden the documents, but their patience was clearly wearing thin. Abigail's vision blurred with tears of frustration. After everything she'd sacrificed, after traveling so far from Boston to build a new life, it would end here in the snow, miles from Cody where she'd begun to feel safe at last. Another shot rang out, and this time her mare stumbled badly, sending Abigail tumbling into the snow. The horse, thankfully uninjured but terrified, bolted toward the tree line. Abigail struggled to her feet, her sodden skirts heavy as lead, just as the three men surrounded her, their horses snorting plumes of steam in the frigid air. "Nowhere to run now, Miss Harlow," growled the scarred man, Silas Tucker, as he dismounted. "You've led us on quite a chase." "I told you I don't have what you're looking for," Abigail said, her voice steadier than she felt. The second man, thin as a rail with yellowed teeth, spat into the snow. "Your brother said different before he died." Abigail flinched at the mention of James. They had killed her only family 3 days ago, and she had barely escaped with her life and the evidence that would expose their criminal operation. "Search her," Tucker ordered the third man, a hulking figure who dismounted with a predatory smile. Before he could reach her, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the tense silence. All four turned to see a lone rider cresting the snow-covered hill, silhouetted against the wintry sky. The stranger urged his magnificent black stallion forward, positioning himself between Abigail and her pursuers in one fluid motion. "Stop," the rider commanded, his voice deep and authoritative. He sat tall in the saddle, a Winchester rifle held casually but purposefully across his lap. His face was partially obscured by a dark hat pulled low against the cold, but Abigail could see the hard set of his jaw and the intensity in his steel-blue eyes. "This isn't your concern, stranger," Tucker said, his hand hovering near his holster. "Ride on." The newcomer didn't move. 3 armed men chasing a woman through the snow in the middle of nowhere, I'd say that makes it my concern. His gaze shifted briefly to Abigail, assessing her disheveled state before returning to the 3 men. "The lady doesn't look like she wants your company." "The lady," sneered the thin man, "is a thief and a murderer." The cowboy's expression remained impassive. "Is that so?" He looked at Abigail again, longer this time. "She doesn't look the type." "I've stolen nothing," Abigail said firmly, finding courage in the stranger's calm presence. "And the only murderers here are them. They killed my brother." The cowboy nodded slightly, as if her words confirmed something he'd already suspected. "I suggest you gentlemen move along. The sheriff in Cody would be interested to hear both sides of this story, I reckon." Tucker's face contorted with rage. "You're making a mistake, cowboy." "Wouldn't be my first," the stranger replied evenly. "But letting 3 men harm a lady would be one I couldn't live with." His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle. "So what's it going to be, gentlemen?" A tense silence descended, broken only by the soft whicker of horses and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Abigail held her breath, Acutely aware that her life hung in the balance of this standoff, Tucker was the first to break, gesturing subtly to his companions. "This isn't over," he warned, mounting his horse with practiced ease. "You've made an enemy today." "Add it to the list," the cowboy replied dryly. With a final venomous glare, Tucker wheeled his horse around. His companions followed suit, and soon the three were disappearing back into the forest, though Abigail knew they wouldn't go far. Only when they were out of sight did the cowboy fully turn his attention to her. He dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered frame. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with several days' worth of stubble darkening a strong jawline and tiny lines at the corners of eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. "You all right, madam?" he asked, approaching slowly as if worried he might startle her. Abigail nodded, though her legs felt suddenly unsteady. The adrenaline that had kept her going began to ebb, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Weston, Wade Weston. Most folks just call me Wade." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "And you are Abigail Harlow." She swayed slightly, and he stepped forward quickly, steadying her with a gentle hand on her arm. "You're half frozen, Miss Harlow. We need to get you somewhere warm." He glanced in the direction her mare had fled. "Can you ride?" Abigail nodded. "Yes, but my horse, she'll likely head back to wherever she's stabled. Horses have good sense that way." He guided her toward his stallion. "For now, you'll have to ride with me. Cody's not far and we need to move quickly. Those men won't stay gone long." As if to emphasize his point, a distant shout echoed through the trees. Wade helped her mount, then swung up behind her with ease. Abigail stiffened slightly at the unfamiliar intimacy of sharing a saddle with a stranger, but the warmth of his solid presence at her back was undeniably reassuring. "Hold on," he murmured, reaching around her to take the reins. His arm formed a protective barrier as he urged his horse forward, leaving behind the trampled snow of the confrontation. As they rode toward Cody, the Wyoming wilderness stretched out around them, beautiful and unforgiving. Abigail, pressed against the chest of the man who had saved her life, felt the first stirrings of hope since her brother's murder. She didn't know if she could trust Wade Weston, but for now she had little choice. The cowboy remained vigilant, scanning their surroundings as they traveled. "You want to tell me what that was about back there?" he eventually asked, his breath warm against her ear. Abigail hesitated, weighing her options. The documents hidden in her boot could expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond 3 thugs in the wilderness. But they had already cost her brother his life, and she wasn't ready to risk this stranger's as well, no matter how capable he seemed. "It's complicated," she finally said, "and dangerous." Wade's chest rumbled with a low chuckle. "Miss Harlow, I just rode between you and 3 armed men. I think we're past the point of avoiding danger." Despite everything, Abigail found herself smiling slightly. "I suppose we are, Mr. Weston." "Wade," he corrected gently. "Wade," she repeated, finding comfort in the simple exchange as they continued toward Cody, leaving tracks in the snow that were quickly filled by fresh flakes beginning to fall from the darkening sky. The ride to Cody took longer than Wade had initially suggested, the snowfall growing heavier with each passing minute. Abigail found herself leaning more heavily against him as fatigue and cold took their toll. His arm tightened around her waist when she swayed. "Stay awake, Miss Harlow," he urged, his voice cutting through the dreamy haze that had begun to envelop her. "Town's just beyond that ridge. Can't have you freezing to death after all the trouble I went through." There was a lightness in his tone that belied the genuine concern in his eyes when she glanced up at him. "I'm awake," she assured him, straightening slightly. "And please call me Abigail." "Abigail," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Pretty name." Before she could respond, the first buildings of Cody came into view, lantern light glowing warmly through the curtain of snow. Relief flooded through her at the sight of civilization, though she knew the danger was far from past. Wade guided his stallion down the main street, past curious onlookers braving the weather. The town was small but prosperous looking, with a general store, saloon, and several other businesses lining the muddy street now hidden beneath snow. "We'll get you to the hotel," Wade said. "It's not fancy, but Mrs. Bennett keeps it clean and warm." "I can't stay at the hotel," Abigail said quickly. "Those men, they'll look for me there first." Wade considered this, then nodded. "You're right, we need somewhere less obvious." He changed direction, guiding his horse toward a modest cabin at the edge of town. "My place isn't much, but you'll be safe there while we figure things out." Under different circumstances, Abigail might have protested the impropriety of staying in a bachelor's home, but survival trumped social conventions. Besides, there was something about Wade Weston that inspired trust, a rare commodity in her experience. The cabin was small but sturdy, set back from the road with a corral beside it where several horses huddled against the cold. Wade dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Abigail's legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and Wade steadied her with strong hands at her waist. "Easy now," he murmured. "Let's get you inside." He led his horse to the small stable attached to the cabin, promising to return quickly. Abigail waited by the door, shivering violently now that they had stopped moving. True to his word, Wade returned moments later and unlocked the cabin, ushering her inside. The interior was simple but surprisingly homey, a far cry from the Spartan bachelor quarters she had expected. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a wooden table and chairs nearby. A curtain partially concealed a narrow bed in one corner, while shelves of books occupied another wall. Everything was neat and orderly, speaking to a methodical nature. Wade immediately set about building a fire, his movements efficient. "Make yourself comfortable," he said over his shoulder. "There's a blanket on the chair there." Abigail gratefully wrapped the offered blanket around her shoulders, watching as he coaxed flames from kindling. Only now, in the safety of the cabin, did the events of the day fully catch up with her. A sob escaped before she could suppress it. Wade turned quickly, concern etched on his features. "Abigail, I'm sorry," she managed, attempting to regain her composure. "It's been a difficult few days." Wade stood, approaching her with the caution one might use with a spooked horse. "Why don't you sit by the fire? I'll make some coffee, and if you feel up to it, you can tell me what kind of trouble you're in." The gentleness in his voice undid her. Tears flowed freely now as Wade guided her to a chair near the growing fire. He didn't rush her or demand explanations, simply placed a cup of water in her hands once the tears subsided, watching her with steady blue eyes that held no judgment. "My brother and I came to Wyoming 3 months ago," Abigail began once she could trust her voice. "James was an engineer hired by the Northern Pacific Railroad to survey for a new line." Wade nodded, leaning against the mantel. "Big project." "Yes, but James discovered irregularities in the surveys already completed, bridges planned for unsafe locations, routes diverted from logical paths." She took a deep breath. At first, he thought it was incompetence, but then he found evidence of bribes, large payments to officials to approve dangerous shortcuts that would save money but put passengers at risk. "And your brother reported this." Abigail's hands tightened around her cup. "He tried, but the corruption went higher than we realized. 3 days ago, those men Tucker and his gang came to our house outside Cody. They demanded James turn over his evidence." Her voice broke. "He refused. They shot him." Wade's expression darkened. "I'm sorry. I was in the back room. They didn't know I was there. I heard everything, the argument, the shot. When they started searching the house, I slipped out with the documents James had gathered." She met Wade's gaze directly. "That's what they want. Proof of a conspiracy that could cost the railroad millions and send several prominent men to prison." Wade was silent for a long moment, processing her story. "These documents, you still have them?" Abigail hesitated, then reached down to her boot, extracting a waterproof oilskin packet. "Yes." "James knew they might come. He prepared this, told me where to find it if anything happened to him." Wade didn't reach for the packet, respecting her possession of it. "You need to take this to the federal marshal," he said finally. "This is bigger than the local sheriff." "The nearest federal marshal is in Cheyenne," Abigail replied. Nearly 200 miles away, I'd never make it alone, especially not in winter. You won't be alone, Wade said with a simplicity that took her breath away. I'll take you. Abigail stared at him, searching his face for signs of ulterior motives. Why would you do that? You don't know me. This isn't your fight. A ghost of a smile touched Wade's lips. I have my reasons. Something in his expression suggested a deeper history than he was sharing. Let's just say I have no love for men who use their power to endanger others. Before Abigail could press further, a sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Wade motioned for her to stay silent, reaching for his pistol as he moved toward the window. Carefully peering through the curtain, his shoulders relaxed slightly. It's Sheriff Donovan, he said, holstering his weapon. Friend of mine, probably wondering about the commotion at the edge of town. He opened the door to reveal a tall, gray-haired man brushing snow from his coat. Wade, the sheriff nodded, then his gaze fell on Abigail. Madam, Sheriff, Wade greeted him. This is Miss Abigail Harlow. She's had some trouble. The sheriff's weathered face showed no surprise. 3 men in town asking after a young woman fits that description, said she's wanted for theft. Did they now? Wade's tone was conversational, but Abigail noticed how he positioned himself subtly between her and the door. And you believed them? Sheriff Donovan snorted. I've been lawman long enough to smell trouble, and those 3 reek of it. His gaze shifted to Abigail. But I need to hear your side, miss. Abigail glanced at Wade, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, she recounted her story again, this time showing the sheriff the documents that proved her claims. Donovan examined them carefully, his expression growing grimmer by the minute. This is serious business, he said finally. Beyond my jurisdiction, you're right about needing the federal marshal. He looked at Wade. You planning to take her to Cheyenne? Wade nodded. As soon as the weather breaks enough to travel, the sheriff considered this. Those men won't give up easily. Tucker's got a reputation as a hired gun who completes his jobs. He stood, straightening his coat. I can hold them in jail for a day, maybe 2, on suspicion of trespassing and disturbing the peace. That might give you a head start. I'd appreciate that, Sheriff, Wade said. I'll have my deputy bring some supplies by tomorrow. Miss Harlow will need warmer clothes for the journey. The sheriff tipped his hat to Abigail. Sorry about your brother, miss. If those men did kill him, they'll answer for it. After the sheriff left, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Abigail stared into the fire, exhaustion overwhelming her now that the immediate danger had passed. Wade moved about quietly, preparing a simple meal of beans and bacon that smelled better than any feast to her hungry senses. You should rest after you eat, he said, placing a plate before her. Take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire. Abigail wanted to protest, but fatigue made her limbs leaden. Thank you, she said instead, the words inadequate for all he'd done. Wade shrugged, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. Anyone would have done the same. No, Abigail said softly, they wouldn't have. Their eyes met across the table, an understanding passing between them that transcended their brief acquaintance. In that moment, Abigail knew with certainty that whatever happened in the days ahead, she could trust Wade Weston with her life. Later, as she lay in his narrow bed, listening to the crack of the fire and his quiet movements as he prepared for their journey, Abigail thought of her brother. James had died protecting the truth, refusing to be part of a scheme that would endanger innocent lives. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain, and perhaps, in the cowboy whose steady presence had already become a comfort, she had found the ally who would help her fulfill that promise. The snowfall continued through the night, blanketing Cody in a thick white layer that muffled sounds and transformed the frontier town into something from a fairy tale. Abigail woke to the scent of coffee and the soft sounds of Wade moving about the cabin. Morning, he said when he noticed her stirring. Storms let up some, but there's a good foot of fresh snow out there. Abigail sat up, smoothing her disheveled hair self-consciously. Will it delay our departure? Wade handed her a steaming cup, by a day at least. Roads to Cheyenne will be near impassable until the stage makes a run through. He smiled slightly at her obvious disappointment. Don't fret. Sheriff Donovan is good to his word, Tucker, and his men won't be causing trouble today." As if summoned by mention of the sheriff, a knock came at the door. This time it was a young deputy, red-faced from the cold, bearing a bundle of clothing and supplies. "Sheriff sends these with his compliments, Miss Harlow," the young man said, carefully averting his eyes from Abigail in her rumpled state. "And he says to tell you the prisoners are secure, Mr. Weston, but there's been inquiries from the railroad office about them." Wade's expression hardened slightly. "What kind of inquiries?" "Telegram came in asking about 3 men working for Northern Pacific who might be in town." "Sheriff hasn't answered yet." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "There was also a rider came in late last night asking questions at the hotel, fancy type from back east by his clothes." Abigail and Wade exchanged a concerned glance. "The conspiracy reaches further than we thought," she said quietly after the deputy had gone. Wade nodded, his expression grim as he checked his Winchester's action. "All the more reason to get those documents to the federal authorities quickly." He handed Abigail the bundle of women's clothing. "These should fit well enough for travel. Mrs. Donovan is about your size." While Wade prepared their horses and gathered additional supplies, Abigail changed into the practical attire: a split riding skirt, heavy woolen shirt, and sheepskin coat that would serve her better on the journey than her city clothes. When Wade returned, he paused momentarily in the doorway, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her transformed appearance. "What?" Abigail asked, suddenly self-conscious. A slow smile spread across his face. "Nothing. Just thinking how different you look from the society lady I expected when I first saw you yesterday." Abigail raised her chin slightly. "I've never been much for society's expectations, Mr. Weston. My father was a professor of natural sciences in Boston. He raised James and me to value knowledge and truth over social conventions." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Wade said, the admiration in his voice warming her more than the fire. "He was," Abigail replied softly. "He would have liked you, I think." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Wade cleared his throat and turned his attention to their preparations. "Sheriff's deputy brought word that the stage cleared the road south this morning. If we leave within the hour, we can make it to the Blackwater Creek station by nightfall." He met her eyes steadily. "It's not going to be an easy journey, Abigail." "I'm stronger than I look," she assured him, tucking the precious documents securely inside her coat. Wade's smile returned, more warmth in it this time. "I don't doubt that for a second." They set out from the cabin an hour later, Wade leading the way on his black stallion while Abigail rode a sturdy bay mare borrowed from the sheriff. The town was beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys as Cody's residents emerged to clear paths through the snow. A few curious glances followed their progress, but no one interfered. "Keep your head down as we pass the jail," Wade advised quietly. "Less chance someone will remember your face later." Abigail nodded, pulling her hat lower as they rode past the small sheriff's office. Through the frost-covered window, she caught a glimpse of Tucker's scarred face watching their departure, his expression murderous. A shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with the cold. They had nearly reached the edge of town when a well-dressed man stepped into the street before them, raising a hand to halt their progress. Something about his immaculate appearance despite the weather set alarm bells ringing in Abigail's mind. "Mr. Weston," the stranger called, his accent marking him as Eastern educated. "A moment of your time, if you please." Wade reined in his horse, his posture relaxed but alert. "Do I know you, sir?" Maxwell Thornton, special agent for Northern Pacific Railroad. The man's smile didn't reach his cold eyes as they flicked to Abigail. "I believe you're accompanying a young lady who has something belonging to my employers." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Wade replied evenly. "This is my cousin heading south to visit family." Thornton's smile tightened. "Come now, Mr. Weston, we both know that's Miss Harlow, sister of the late James Harlow, who absconded with confidential company documents before his unfortunate accident." "Accident?" Abigail couldn't contain her outrage. "Your men murdered him in cold blood. Wade shot her a warning glance, but the damage was done. Thornton's expression shifted to one of smug satisfaction. "I see the lady admits her identity," he said. "Now, Miss Harlow, if you'll simply return the company property you've taken, we can avoid any further unpleasantness." Wade moved his horse slightly, positioning himself between Thornton and Abigail. "The lady isn't going anywhere with you, Thornton. And any documents she may have are evidence in a murder investigation now." Thornton's facade of civility slipped momentarily. "You're making a serious mistake, Weston. The railroad has considerable influence in this territory." "So I've heard," Wade replied coldly. "Enough to buy off surveyors and officials, apparently. Not enough to cover up murder, though." A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Thornton, clearly aware of the public nature of their exchange, forced his expression back to one of professional concern. "This is a simple misunderstanding that can be resolved privately," he said. "Miss Harlow is understandably distraught after her brother's death, but making wild accusations won't bring him back." "Perhaps not," came a new voice as Sheriff Donovan approached, "but evidence might bring his killers to justice." He nodded to Wade and Abigail. "You folks continuing your journey south?" "We are, Sheriff," Wade confirmed, understanding the offered opening. "My cousin's family will be worried if we delay much longer." Thornton stepped forward. "Sheriff, I must insist you detain these people. They're in possession of stolen property." "Funny," the sheriff interrupted. "I don't recall seeing any theft reports cross my desk." "What exactly was stolen, Mr. Thornton?" The railroad agent faltered momentarily. "Confidential company documents, internal matters." "Well now, that's vague," Donovan drawled. "Can't arrest folks on vague charges." "Now, I do have 3 men in my jail who attempted to assault a young woman yesterday. Perhaps you'd like to explain your connection to them instead." Thornton's face hardened. "We'll continue this discussion through official channels, Sheriff." His gaze shifted to Abigail. "This isn't over, Miss Harlow." "No," she agreed quietly. "It's only beginning." With a curt nod to the sheriff, Wade urged his horse forward, Abigail following close behind. They left Cody under the watchful eyes of its citizens, the confrontation already becoming the day's most interesting gossip. Once they were beyond the town limits, Wade slowed his pace to ride beside Abigail. "That complicates things," he said grimly. "Thornton will telegraph ahead to every station between here and Cheyenne." "What do we do?" Abigail asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Wade considered for a moment, his eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape. "Change our route. Take the old military road through the mountains instead of following the stage line." "Is it safe?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Safer than facing whatever reception Thornton's arranging for us." They rode in silence for several miles, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath hooves and the occasional call of winter birds. The sun emerged from behind clouds, turning the landscape into a glittering expanse that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. "You never told me what you do in Cody," Abigail said eventually, curious about the man who had so unhesitatingly come to her aid. Wade glanced at her, seeming almost surprised by the personal question. "I break horses mainly, train them for ranchers and the cavalry sometimes." "You're good with animals," she observed, noting how easily he handled his spirited stallion. "Better than with people most days," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "Animals don't lie or cheat. You know where you stand with a horse." "And where do you stand with railroad agents and hired gunmen?" Abigail asked lightly. This time his smile held genuine amusement. "Preferably upwind and with plenty of ammunition." The unexpected humor startled a laugh from Abigail, the sound bright in the winter stillness. Wade's expression softened as he watched her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You have a nice laugh," he said simply. Abigail felt warmth rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the exertion of riding. "I haven't had much cause for it lately." "No, I don't suppose you have." His gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he turned his attention back to the trail. "There's a line shack about 10 miles ahead where we can rest the horses and eat something. We should reach it by midday if the snow holds off." As if defying his words, fat flakes began to fall from the suddenly darkened sky. Wade frowned at the gathering clouds. Weather's changing faster than I expected. We need to pick up the pace. They urged their mounts to a faster gait, but the intensifying snowfall soon reduced visibility to mere yards ahead. The wind rose, driving the snow horizontally and turning their journey into a battle against the elements. Abigail's face burned from the cold despite the scarf wrapped around her lower features, and her hands, even in thick gloves, grew numb on the reins. "Wade," she called, barely audible over the wind. "I can't see the trail," he circled back to her, snow crusting his hat and coat. "Stay close," he shouted. "The shack can't be more than a mile ahead now." They pressed on through the blinding whiteness, the horses struggling against drifts that grew deeper with each passing minute. Abigail focused on the dark shape of Wade's back, fear gnawing at her as the storm intensified to a full blizzard. Had they strayed from the path? Would they freeze to death within sight of shelter, becoming just two more victims of Wyoming's merciless winter? Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Wade's voice cut through the howling wind. "There, I see it." Squinting through snow-crusted lashes, Abigail made out a dark rectangle against the whiteness, a small wooden structure nearly buried in drifts. New energy surged through her as they guided their exhausted horses the final 100 yards. The line shack was crude but solid, built to shelter cowboys and travelers caught in exactly the kind of storm that now raged around them. Wade dismounted stiffly, helping Abigail from her saddle before leading both horses to the small lean-to attached to the main structure. "Get inside," he urged, pressing the cabin key into her frozen hand. "Start a fire if you can, I'll see to the horses." The interior of the shack was cold and dark, but blessedly free from the wind's assault. Abigail fumbled with frozen fingers to light the lantern left hanging by the door, then turned her attention to the small stone fireplace. Kindling and split logs had been neatly stacked beside it, a cowboy's courtesy to the next traveler that might mean the difference between life and death in a Wyoming winter. By the time Wade entered, stamping snow from his boots, Abigail had a small fire crackling in the grate. He closed the door against the howling wind and leaned against it for a moment, exhaustion evident in the slump of his broad shoulders. "Horses are sheltered and fed," he reported, moving to the fire and extending his hands toward the warmth. "Storm's getting worse. We won't be going anywhere until it passes." Abigail nodded, a mixture of relief and concern washing through her. "How long do these blizzards usually last? A day, sometimes two." He glanced around the cabin. "We have enough supplies, might get a bit cozy, but we won't starve or freeze." The implications of being snowbound in the tiny cabin with a man she'd known for barely 24 hours weren't lost on Abigail. In Boston, such a situation would mean social ruin. Here in the wilderness, with men hunting her, it seemed the least of her concerns. Wade seemed to read her thoughts. "I'll sleep by the door," he said quietly. "You take the bunk." "Don't be ridiculous," Abigail replied, finding her voice. "It's freezing by the door and you need proper rest as much as I do. The bunk is narrow but adequate for both of us if we're sensible about it." A hint of color touched Wade's cheekbones, visible even in the dim light. "Your reputation is the least of my worries right now," she finished for him. "Besides, who's to know out here?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair point." They settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine as the day progressed, Wade tending the fire while Abigail prepared a simple meal from their supplies. The cabin gradually warmed, allowing them to remove their heavy outer layers and move more freely in the confined space. "You never said how you came to be a horse trainer in Wyoming," Abigail remarked as they sat before the fire, steam rising from tin cups of coffee in their hands. Wade was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "I was Army once," he finally said. "Cavalry. Stationed at Fort Laramie after the war." "What happened?" His expression closed slightly. "Disagreed with a superior officer about the treatment of some Cheyenne prisoners. He suggested I resign my commission before facing court-martial. I suggested he perform an anatomically impossible act." A wry smile touched his lips. Neither of us got exactly what we wanted, but I ended up a civilian. Abigail couldn't help but smile at his phrasing. So you've been defending the defenseless for some time then? Wade shrugged, obviously uncomfortable with her characterization. I just don't cotton to bullies, whether they wear a uniform or not. Is that why you stepped between me and those men yesterday? Because they were bullies. His eyes met hers, startlingly direct. I stepped between you and those men because no decent human being could ride past a woman in danger. The fact that you're brave enough to stand up to powerful men for your brother's sake just confirms I made the right choice. Something shifted in the atmosphere between them, the small cabin suddenly feeling even more intimate. Abigail was acutely aware of Wade's proximity, the firelight casting shadows across his strong features, softening the edges of a face that had clearly weathered its share of hardship. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for yesterday, but for everything since. You've risked so much for a stranger." "You don't feel much like a stranger anymore," Wade replied, his voice equally quiet, their eyes held for a long moment before Wade cleared his throat and stood, moving to check the shuttered window. "Storm's not letting up. We should try to get some rest while we can." Sleep proved elusive for Abigail despite her exhaustion. The narrow bunk, though warmed by Wade's solid presence at a carefully maintained distance, felt foreign and strange. Outside, the wind moaned around the cabin's corners like a living thing, while inside she was hyper-aware of every breath, every slight movement from the man lying beside her. "You're thinking so loudly I can almost hear the words," Wade murmured eventually, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. Abigail turned her head slightly toward him. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to keep you awake. You're not, I don't sleep much these days." There was a hint of old pain in the admission. "What's on your mind?" "Everything," she admitted. "James, the documents, those men." "Wondering if we'll make it to Cheyenne." She paused. "Wondering what happens after if we do." Wade was silent for a moment. "After is always the hardest part to figure," he said finally. "During, you just do what needs doing. After, that's when choices really matter. What will you do?" "After, I mean," she felt rather than saw his shrug in the darkness. "Go back to Cody, break horses, live quietly." "Alone," the question slipped out before she could stop it. Another pause, longer this time. "Been that way a while now, suits me well enough." Something in his tone suggested otherwise, but Abigail didn't press. Instead, she asked, "Was there ever someone before?" "Once," Wade answered, his voice softer now. "Her name was Sarah. We were to be married when I returned from the war." He took a deep breath. "Influenza took her while I was away. Never even got to say goodbye." "I'm sorry," Abigail whispered, understanding now the shadow that sometimes crossed his face. "It was a long time ago," Wade said, though his voice suggested the wound wasn't fully healed. "What about you?" "No suitor waiting in Boston," Abigail smiled slightly in the darkness. "There was a professor at my father's university who made his intentions clear. Brilliant man, but cold. He wanted a wife to advance his social standing, not a partner." She sighed. "When father died and left us with debts, the professor's interest cooled considerably." "His loss," Wade said simply. The sincerity in those two words warmed her more than any elaborate compliment. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, the storm's fury gradually lulling Abigail toward sleep. Her last conscious thought was how strange it was that she felt safer in this remote cabin with a man she barely knew than she had anywhere since her brother's murder. Morning brought weakened sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window, revealing a world transformed by the blizzard. Drifts piled against the walls reached nearly to the roof in places, while the door, when Wade cautiously opened it, revealed a wall of white that he had to shovel through before they could exit. "We won't be traveling today," he announced, stamping snow from his boots as he returned from checking on the horses. "Drifts are too deep even for the main trails. We'll have to wait for it to settle and compact some." Abigail tried to hide her disappointment. Every delay increased the chances of Tucker and his men or the more dangerous Thornton picking up their trail again. "How much longer do you think we'll be delayed?" she asked. Wade considered, running a hand through his dark hair. Tomorrow, maybe the day after at latest. The sun's out now, that'll help melt things down some. He studied her worried expression. We'll make it to Cheyenne, Abigail, I promise you that, she nodded, trusting him despite the circumstances. I know, it's just, James deserved better than this. Than being dismissed as an unfortunate accident while his killers walk free. Your brother sounds like he was a good man, Wade said quietly. He was. Abigail smiled slightly, remembering. Brilliant but absent-minded. He could calculate complex mathematical equations in his head, but constantly misplaced his spectacles. He took care of me after our parents died, made sure I continued my education when many said it was a waste for a woman. Wade listened intently as she spoke, his expression suggesting genuine interest rather than mere politeness. You were close. He was all the family I had left, Abigail confirmed, blinking back unexpected tears. Now there's no one. Wade hesitated, then reached across the small table to cover her hand with his. You're not alone in this, he said firmly. Not anymore. The simple touch and sincere words broke something inside her. Tears she had held back since finding James's body spilled freely now, grief finally finding its expression. Wade said nothing, simply maintaining his gentle hold on her hand, offering silent support until the storm passed. I'm sorry, Abigail said finally, wiping her eyes with her free hand. Don't be, Wade replied. Some hurts need letting out before they can start healing. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of kindred spirits who had both known loss. Wade's thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand before he reluctantly released it. I should check our supplies, he said, rising from the table. Make sure we have enough for another day. The hours of confinement passed more quickly than Abigail had expected. Wade proved to be an engaging companion, sharing stories of his time in the cavalry and his adventures breaking wild horses. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, her father's scientific expeditions, and her own aspirations to write about the natural world. You should, Wade encouraged when she mentioned her dream of publishing scientific observations. The West needs more honest accounts, especially from women's perspectives. Perhaps I will, Abigail mused, once this business with the railroad is settled. As evening approached, bringing with it plummeting temperatures, they huddled closer to the fire, sharing the last of their coffee. Tell me about Cody, Abigail requested. What made you settle there? Wade's expression grew thoughtful. Wasn't planning to, initially. Was just passing through on my way further west when my horse came up lame. Stayed to let him heal and ended up taking a job breaking horses for old man Jenkins. A slight smile touched his lips. Before I knew it, a month had turned into a year and I'd bought that cabin on the edge of town. Do you ever regret it, staying? No, he answered without hesitation. Cody's a good place. People mind their business but help when needed, land's beautiful if unforgiving. His gaze met hers. It's home now. Something in his tone made Abigail wonder if he was offering more than just information about his chosen residence. Before she could respond, a sound outside the cabin froze them both, the distinct crunch of footsteps in snow. Wade was on his feet instantly, finger to his lips as he reached for his Winchester. Abigail's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed back against the cabin wall, eyes fixed on the door. Had Tucker and his men tracked them through the blizzard? Or was it Thornton with hired guns of his own? The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, pausing at the lean to where the horses were stabled. Wade moved silently to position himself beside the window, carefully easing the shutter open a crack to peer outside. Can't see anyone, he whispered. But someone's definitely. A sharp knock at the door cut him off. Hello, the cabin, called a male voice unfamiliar to Abigail. Anyone alive in there? Wade relaxed slightly, though he kept his rifle ready. Who's asking? He called back, name's Morgan, Patrick Morgan. I'm with the stage line, checking the route after the storm, saw smoke from your chimney. Wade exchanged a glance with Abigail, caution in his eyes. Wait here, he murmured before approaching the door. Coming out, he called, then unbarred the door and stepped outside, leaving it partially open behind him. Abigail strained to hear the conversation, catching only fragments as Wade and the stranger spoke in low tones. After what seemed an eternity, Wade returned, followed by a snow-covered man in his 50s with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Miss Harlow," Wade said formally, "this is Mr. Morgan, indeed of the stage line. He's just come from Cody." Morgan removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Abigail. "Madam, nasty business about your brother. Sheriff Donovan filled me in when I stopped for supplies." Abigail glanced questioningly at Wade, who nodded slightly, indicating Morgan could be trusted. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan," she said. "Have you news from town?" The stage driver accepted the cup of coffee Wade offered, warming his hands around it before answering. "Those men that were after you broke jail last night overpowered young Deputy Williams when he brought their dinner. Sheriffs formed a posse, but the storm wiped out any tracks." Abigail's stomach clenched with renewed fear. Wade's expression hardened. "That's not all," Morgan continued. "That railroad fella Thornton, he's offering a reward for information on your whereabouts, $500, which is a fortune in these parts." He looked apologetically at Abigail. "Folks in town are mostly decent, but that kind of money turns heads." "Are they searching for us?" Wade asked. Morgan nodded grimly. "Every trail south. Thornton's convinced you're heading for Cheyenne, has men watching the stage stops and river crossings." He paused. "Sheriff Donovan asked me to tell you if I found you that he can't hold them off much longer. Whatever you're planning, best do it quick." Wade absorbed this information silently, his gaze meeting Abigail's across the small cabin. "Thank you for the warning, Morgan." The stage driver finished his coffee and stood. "I should get going. Need to check the rest of the route before dark." He hesitated. "For what it's worth, most folks in Cody are pulling for you too, sheriff included. Whatever's in those documents must be mighty important for the railroad to go to such lengths." After Morgan departed, promising to tell no one of their location, Wade barred the door again and turned to Abigail. "We need to change our plans," he said without preamble. "They'll be watching every approach to Cheyenne now." "What options do we have?" Abigail asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Wade paced the small cabin, brow furrowed in thought. "There's a Union Pacific station at Rock Springs, west of here. From there, we could take the train east to Laramie, where there's also a federal marshal." "But wouldn't they be watching the trains too?" "Likely," Wade admitted. "But they're focused on the route south. If we head west first, then east, we might slip past them." He paused. "It's risky, though. Adds days to our journey, and we'd be in the open more." Abigail considered this, her hand unconsciously moving to the documents hidden inside her shirt. "James would say the shortest distance between 2 points isn't always a straight line," she said finally. "If Rock Springs gives us a better chance of success, then that's where we should go." Wade studied her for a long moment, respect evident in his gaze. "You're a remarkable woman, Abigail Harlow." The compliment warmed her cheeks. "I'm simply doing what needs to be done." "That's precisely what makes you remarkable." Wade moved to the map he had spread on the table earlier. "If the weather holds, we can leave at first light tomorrow. There's a ranch about 15 miles west where we can rest the horses and perhaps get fresh mounts." As they planned their new route, Abigail found herself watching Wade, the confidence in his movements, the intelligence in his eyes as he considered and discarded options, the gentleness in his hands as he folded the map. In just 2 days, this man had risked everything to help her, a stranger. In the process, he had become something else entirely, a friend, a protector, and perhaps something more that she wasn't ready to name. That night, as they lay in the narrow bunk again, the customary space between them seemed to have shrunk. Abigail was acutely aware of Wade's warmth, the rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of pine and leather that clung to him. "Wade," she whispered into the darkness. He sounded half asleep. "Thank you for everything." She felt him shift slightly beside her. "Get some rest, Abigail. Tomorrow will be a long day." But as she drifted toward sleep, his hand found hers beneath the blanket, fingers intertwining in a silent promise that transcended words. Dawn broke clear and cold, the sun transforming the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling white expanse that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Wade and Abigail set out early, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they urged their horses through drifts that sometimes reached the animals' chests. "The main trail should be clearer once we reach it," Wade assured her as they struggled through a particularly deep section. Stage would have run by now if Morgan completed his route yesterday. They rode in companionable silence for much of the morning, both alert for any sign of pursuit. By midday, the sun had softened the snow enough to make travel easier, and they made good progress toward the ranch Wade had mentioned. "Tell me about this ranch," Abigail requested as they paused to rest the horses. "Are the owners friends of yours?" Wade adjusted his saddle before answering. "Not friends exactly. The Carsons run cattle on the North Fork of the Shoshone. Good people, fair. I broke horses for them last spring." He glanced at her. "Mrs. Carson is originally from Philadelphia. She might appreciate some Eastern conversation." Abigail smiled at the consideration behind his words. "And Mr. Carson, will he ask questions about our journey?" "Sam Carson minds his own business, which is why I trust him," Wade replied. "He won't pry, but he'll help if asked." They reached the Carson Ranch by mid-afternoon, a substantial spread with a main house, bunkhouse, and several outbuildings nestled in a protected valley. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of activity drifted toward them as they approached. A tall man in his 40s emerged from the barn as they rode into the yard, recognition dawning on his weathered face when he saw Wade. "Weston," he called in greeting. "Didn't expect to see anyone on the trails after that blizzard." "Carson," Wade nodded, dismounting and extending his hand. "Hope we're not imposing." "Nonsense. Alina will be pleased to have company." Carson's curious gaze shifted to Abigail, who remained mounted. Wade performed the introductions smoothly. "Sam Carson, this is Miss Abigail Harlow. We're traveling to Rock Springs on urgent business." Understanding flickered in Carson's eyes at the deliberate vagueness. "Miss Harlow, welcome to Black Rock Ranch." He turned back to Wade. "You'll stay the night, of course. Your horses look spent and another storm's brewing." Before Wade could respond, a woman's voice called from the house. "Sam." "Who's arrived?" Alina Carson proved to be a handsome woman in her early 40s, with intelligent eyes and a warm smile that immediately put Abigail at ease. She insisted on drawing a hot bath for Abigail while the men tended to the horses, an offer so tempting that Abigail nearly wept with gratitude. "It's been an age since I've had another woman to talk with," Alina confessed as she showed Abigail to a small but comfortable guest room. "The nearest neighbor is 20 miles away, and she's not one for conversation." The bath was heavenly, the first real cleansing Abigail had enjoyed since fleeing her home days earlier. Alina provided clean clothes, slightly large but infinitely preferable to Abigail's travel-worn attire. "My sister's," Alina explained. "She visits from Philadelphia each summer. You're about her size." Over dinner, a hearty stew that tasted like ambrosia after days of trail rations conversation flowed easily. The Carsons were intelligent, well-read people who seemed to understand instinctively that their guest's journey involved sensitive matters best left unquestioned. Instead, they discussed books, ranching, the harsh Wyoming winter, and Alina's efforts to establish a small school for the children of nearby ranches. Abigail found herself relaxing truly for the first time in days, almost forgetting the danger that had driven them to this isolated haven. She couldn't help noticing how Wade seemed to flourish in this environment, too, his usual reserve softening, as he discussed horseflesh with Sam and praised Alina's cooking. Once, catching Abigail watching him, he smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his features and quickened her pulse. Later, as Alina showed her to the guest room again, the older woman paused at the door. "He's a good man, your Mr. Weston," she said quietly. "Sam says there's no finer horseman in 3 territories and no more honest dealer." Abigail felt color rise to her cheeks. "He's not my Mr. Weston," she demurred. "We're merely traveling companions by necessity." Alina's knowing smile suggested she wasn't convinced. "Perhaps. But I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." She patted Abigail's arm gently. Sleep well, dear. Morning comes early on a ranch. Alone in the comfortable bed, Abigail found her thoughts returning to Wade, sleeping in the bunkhouse with Sam's ranch hands. Was Alina right about the way he looked at her? More disturbingly, was she right about how Abigail herself felt? It seemed impossible that in the space of 3 days, a stranger could come to occupy so much of her thoughts. Yet here she was, missing Wade's presence beside her, wondering if he was lying awake thinking of her too. "This is madness," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "You're running for your life, your brother's murderers are hunting you, and you're mooning over a man you barely know like a schoolgirl." Yet even as she chided herself, Abigail knew the connection between them was real, forged in danger and strengthened by mutual respect. Whether it could survive beyond their current circumstances remained to be seen. But for now, the knowledge that Wade Weston was nearby brought her comfort enough to finally sleep. Morning brought a flurry of activity as they prepared to depart. Sam Carson insisted on providing them with fresh horses, strong, sure-footed animals better suited to the difficult terrain ahead than their tired mounts. "Consider it a loan," he told Wade when the latter attempted to pay. "You can return them when your business is concluded." Alina pressed provisions upon them: bread, cheese, dried meat, and even a jar of preserved peaches that she insisted Abigail take for strength. The older woman embraced Abigail warmly before they mounted up. "Be careful," she murmured, "and remember what I said." Wade and Sam spoke privately for several minutes, their expressions serious. When they rejoined the women, Sam handed Wade a folded paper. "Map of the old mining trails," he explained. "Less traveled, especially this time of year, but could save you a day if weather permits." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, the Carson family watching from the yard. Abigail felt a pang of regret at leaving the warmth and safety of the ranch, but the documents inside her coat were a constant reminder of their mission's urgency. "What did Mr. Carson tell you?" she asked once they were well away from the ranch. Wade's expression was grim. "There's been riders asking after us at every settlement within 50 miles, not just Tucker and his men, others too. Thornton's hired every gun he can find." Abigail's stomach tightened with renewed fear. "How could they know we're heading west?" "They don't, specifically. They're searching every direction." Wade guided his mount around a fallen log. But Sam heard something else. "There's a telegram from Washington ordering Thornton to recover those documents by any means necessary. Whatever evidence your brother found, it goes higher than just the Northern Pacific." "Government officials," Abigail said softly, the pieces falling into place. "James mentioned land grants approved despite clear safety concerns, federal inspectors who suddenly changed their reports." Wade nodded. "Which explains the resources being deployed against us. We're not just facing a railroad company now, we're facing people with government authority." The implications were staggering. Abigail had known the documents were important, but the scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer and far more dangerous with each passing day. "Does this change our plans?" she asked. Wade considered before answering. "We'll still head for Rock Springs, but we need to be more cautious. Stay off the main trails when possible, avoid settlements unless absolutely necessary." They rode hard that day, following Sam Carson's map through narrow valleys and along ridge lines that offered views of the surrounding territory. Twice, Wade spotted distant riders and led them into dense forest until the potential threat passed. By nightfall, they had covered impressive ground but were still at least 2 days from Rock Springs. They made camp in a sheltered hollow beside a half-frozen stream, building only a small fire that would be invisible from a distance. As they ate a simple meal from Alina's provisions, Abigail studied Wade's face in the flickering light. "You're worried," she observed. "More than before." Wade didn't deny it. "The stakes keep rising," he said simply. "And I don't like that they know we're out here, makes us predictable." "Perhaps we should separate," Abigail suggested reluctantly. "I could continue alone while you create a diversion." The look Wade gave her was almost fierce in its intensity. "Not a chance," he said flatly. "We stay together." Something in his tone sent warmth spreading through Abigail despite the cold night air. I just meant I know what you meant, Wade interrupted, his expression softening. And it's brave of you to offer. But aside from the practical considerations, you don't know the territory, aren't familiar with winter survival, there's a simpler reason. He met her eyes directly. I wouldn't be able to focus on anything if I was wondering whether you were safe. The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than perhaps he had intended. Abigail's heart beat faster as she held his gaze. I feel the same, she confessed quietly. About you, I mean, I would worry. Wade's expression changed, subtly surprise giving way to something warmer, more intense. He moved closer, his hand coming up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. Abigail, he began, his voice lower than usual. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of a horse whinnying. Wade was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand as he extinguished their small fire with a boot. Someone's close, he whispered. Gather your things, quickly. They broke camp with practiced efficiency, Wade leading their horses through the darkness with only the stars to guide them. For hours, they traveled in tense silence, stopping occasionally to listen for pursuit. By dawn, they were exhausted but had put significant distance between themselves and whoever had been nearby. We need to rest, Wade finally said as the sun rose, both us and the horses. They found shelter in a stand of pines, the thick branches providing cover from above while the trunks shielded them from view. Wade insisted Abigail sleep first while he kept watch, and she was too exhausted to argue. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky and Wade was slumped against a tree trunk, his head nodding despite his best efforts to stay alert. Abigail moved to him quietly, touching his shoulder. Your turn, she said softly. I'll watch. Wade started to protest, then seemed to recognize the determination in her eyes. With a grateful nod, he stretched out on the bedroll she had just vacated, asleep almost instantly. Abigail settled against a tree trunk, rifle across her lap as Wade had shown her, watching the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. The peaceful setting belied the danger they faced, birds singing and sunlight dappling through pine boughs as if this were merely a pleasant outing rather than a desperate flight. Her gaze kept returning to Wade as he slept, the strong lines of his face relaxed in repose, one hand curled loosely near his holstered pistol even in sleep. She thought of how different her life had been just a week ago, how she could never have imagined meeting someone like him. What would happen when their journey ended? Would he simply return to Cody and his solitary life once the documents were safely delivered? The thought brought an unexpected pang of loss that surprised her with its intensity. Wade stirred, perhaps sensing her scrutiny, his eyes opening to meet hers directly. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them before Wade sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. How long did I sleep? He asked, voice rough from rest. A few hours, Abigail replied. No sign of anyone, he nodded, stretching muscles stiff from the cold ground. Good, we should move on soon. With luck, we can reach the foothills by nightfall. They ate a quick meal before continuing their journey, the terrain growing steeper as they approached the mountains that separated them from Rock Springs. The weather held clear but cold, the sun beginning its descent as they reached the narrower trails that would take them through the pass. We'll need to lead the horses through some sections, Wade explained as they dismounted at the trail's start. It's too steep and narrow to ride safely. The path was indeed treacherous, a rocky track barely wide enough for a horse, with a sheer drop on one side and towering rock face on the other. They proceeded cautiously, Wade leading the way with his mount while Abigail followed several yards behind with hers. They had navigated perhaps half the treacherous path when a shot rang out, the bullet striking rock inches from Wade's head. He reacted instantly, pulling his horse to the cliffside of the trail and drawing his pistol in one fluid motion. Get down, he shouted to Abigail as more shots followed, echoing confusingly in the narrow pass. Abigail pressed herself against the rock face, heart hammering as she tried to locate the source of the gunfire. A movement above caught her eye, 3 figures on the ridge, using the height advantage to fire down at them. Tucker, she breathed, recognizing the scarred face even at a distance. Wade was returning fire, but their position was desperately exposed. The horses, panicked by the gunfire, threatened to bolt or worse, slip over the edge of the narrow trail. "There's a wider section ahead," Wade called to her between shots. "If we can reach it, we'll have better cover." Abigail nodded, gathering her horse's reins more firmly. "I'm ready." "On my mark," Wade said, checking his pistol. 3, 2, 1 now. They surged forward, half running, half sliding along the treacherous path as bullets kicked up stone around them. Abigail's heart was in her throat, every step a potential disaster on the narrow trail. Wade remained slightly ahead, occasionally turning to fire up at their pursuers, forcing the men to duck and disrupting their aim. They had almost reached the wider section when Abigail's horse, struck by a ricocheting bullet, reared in pain and terror. She clung desperately to the reins, trying to control the panicked animal, but its hooves slipped on the loose shale. With a terrified whinny, the horse lost its footing, tumbling toward the edge of the trail. Abigail released the reins just in time to avoid being dragged over with it, but the momentum sent her sprawling dangerously close to the drop-off. She scrabbled for purchase as loose stones gave way beneath her fingers, a scream torn from her throat as she felt herself sliding. Suddenly, strong hands seized her arms, halting her descent. Wade dragged her back from the edge with desperate strength, bullets still flying around them. "I've got you," he gasped, pulling her against his chest as they crouched behind a boulder. "Are you hurt?" Abigail shook her head, too shaken to speak. The sound of her horse's terrified cries echoed from the ravine below, cutting off abruptly in a way that made her stomach clench. Wade's face was grim as he checked his ammunition. "We need to reach that wider section. Can you run?" Abigail nodded, forcing strength into trembling limbs. "Yes, stay low, follow me." Wade fired several shots to provide cover, then seized her hand. "Now." They ran, half-crouched, along the remaining stretch of narrow trail, bullets striking stone around them. Abigail focused only on Wade's hand gripping hers, on placing her feet where his had been, on the promise of safety ahead. The trail widened suddenly into a small plateau with several large boulders, not ideal cover, but infinitely better than their previous exposed position. Wade pulled her behind the largest rock just as a bullet struck where they had been standing. "We're pinned down," he said grimly, checking his remaining ammunition, "and they have the high ground." Abigail's mind raced. "Can we double back?" "Not without crossing open ground. They'd pick us off easily." Wade peered around the boulder, ducking back as another shot rang out. "They're working their way down, trying to flank us." The situation seemed hopeless. One horse lost, the other tethered and exposed further along the trail, 3 armed men with superior position closing in. The documents that had cost James his life would now claim theirs as well. Wade seemed to read her thoughts. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "I'm not letting them take you, Abigail." The fierce protectiveness in his voice gave her courage. "What can we do?" Wade considered their options, eyes scanning the terrain. "If I can draw their fire, create a diversion, you might be able to reach my horse. The trail continues beyond this plateau and joins a wider path about half a mile ahead." "A diversion," Abigail repeated, dread filling her at his implication. "You mean sacrifice yourself?" "Not planning on dying today," Wade replied with forced lightness. "Just giving them something to shoot at besides you." "No," Abigail said flatly. "I won't leave you." Wade's expression softened momentarily. "Stubborn woman," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, more firmly, "Those documents need to reach the authorities. Your brother died for them. Don't let that be for nothing." Before she could argue further, a new sound cut through the sporadic gunfire hoofbeats, many of them approaching rapidly from the direction they had been heading. Wade and Abigail exchanged confused glances. "Thornton," she whispered fearfully. The answer came in the form of a volley of gunfire not directed at them, but at their pursuers on the ridge. Shouts and curses echoed as Tucker and his men scrambled for cover. Riders coming in. Called a voice from beyond their position. "Weston, you alive back there?" Wade's expression transformed with recognition. "Carson," he breathed, then called back. "Still breathing, ladies with me." Sam Carson's voice carried clearly. Stay put, we're handling these vermin. The firefight was brief but intense. Tucker and his companions clearly outmatched by Carson and what sounded like several of his ranch hands. Within minutes, the shooting stopped, replaced by the sound of men making their way carefully down the ridge. Wade kept Abigail behind him, pistol ready, until Carson's familiar figure appeared around the bend in the trail, rifle in hand. "Told Alina you two might need backup," the rancher said by way of greeting. "Followed your trail this morning, then heard the shooting." His gaze shifted to Abigail. "You all right, Miss Harlow?" Abigail nodded, relief making her light-headed. "Yes, thanks to you." Carson gestured to the men behind him, 4 ranch hands, all armed and watchful. "Tucker and one of his boys are dead. Third one's wounded but alive. Thought you might want to question him." Wade's expression was grim as he holstered his pistol. "I do indeed." He turned to Abigail. "Wait here." "No," she said firmly, rising to stand beside him. "I want to hear what he has to say." The wounded man proved to be the thin, yellow-toothed companion who had been with Tucker from the beginning. He sat propped against a rock, blood seeping from a shoulder wound, his face pale with pain and fear as Wade and Abigail approached. "Didn't want any of this," he said immediately, eyes darting between them. "Tucker was paying good money is all, didn't know he meant to kill nobody." "But he did kill," Wade said coldly. "Miss Harlow's brother, for one." The man licked dry lips. "That wasn't supposed to happen neither." "Was just meant to scare him, get the papers back. Thornton said no killing." Abigail stepped forward. "Thornton ordered you to retrieve the documents." "Maxwell Thornton of the Northern Pacific." The wounded man nodded eagerly, perhaps sensing that cooperation was his only chance. "Him and some government fella from Washington. Big money involved. Something about land grants and stock prices." He winced as his movement jarred his injury. "Tucker got greedy, went off script when your brother wouldn't hand over the papers. Thornton was furious when he found out." "Not furious enough to turn Tucker in," Wade observed. "Couldn't risk it. Too much at stake." The man's eyes fixed on Abigail pleadingly. "I never hurt nobody, miss, just rode with the wrong crowd." Abigail studied him, remembering the terror of being chased through the snow, the sound of bullets flying past her head. "Where is Thornton now?" "Rock Springs," came the immediate reply. "Waiting at the railroad office, has men watching every approach to town." His gaze shifted between them desperately. "That's all I know, I swear." Wade and Carson exchanged glances. "Changes our plans," Wade said grimly. Carson nodded. "My men will take this one to the sheriff in Cody. Evidence of his confession might be useful." He turned to Wade. "What do you need?" "A clear path to Laramie," Wade replied after a moment's thought. "Bypassing Rock Springs entirely." Carson considered this. "There's an old trapper's trail through Medicine Bow, rough going this time of year, but it would bring you out south of Laramie. 2, maybe 3 days hard riding." "We'll need fresh horses," Wade said, glancing at Abigail apologetically. "Yours was lost in the gunfight." "Take mine," Carson offered immediately, "and we'll here can spare his too." He nodded to one of his men. "We can double up on the ride back to the ranch." As Carson's men secured the prisoner and prepared for the journey back, Wade pulled Abigail aside. "This route will be harder," he warned. "Colder, more isolated, but it may be our only chance now that Thornton's watching Rock Springs." Abigail squared her shoulders, determination replacing the fear and exhaustion of moments before. "Then that's the way we'll go." She met his eyes directly. "I trust you, Wade." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion she couldn't name. "We'll make it," he promised softly. "Together." The word hung between them, laden with meaning that extended beyond their immediate circumstances. Before either could speak further, Carson approached with the promised horses. "Best get moving," he advised. "Daylight's wasting, and you've got hard country ahead." With hasty but heartfelt thanks to their rescuers, Wade and Abigail mounted the fresh horses and continued their journey, no longer heading west to Rock Springs, but south toward Laramie and, they hoped, justice for James Harlow. The trapper's trail proved to be everything Carson had warned, and more a barely discernible path through some of the most rugged terrain Wyoming had to offer. They traveled until dusk, making camp in a small cave that provided shelter from the biting wind that had risen as the sun set. "Not the Carsons' guest room," Wade remarked as he built a small fire near the cave entrance, "but it should keep us from freezing tonight." Abigail smiled tiredly, helping to unpack their meager supplies. "After today, any shelter feels luxurious." They ate in companionable silence, both processing the day's narrow escape. The cave gradually warmed from the fire, creating a surprisingly cozy atmosphere despite their circumstances. "I keep thinking about what that man said," Abigail mused as they finished their meal. "About government officials being involved with the railroad fraud," Wade nodded grimly. "Makes sense. The Northern Pacific couldn't secure those land grants without high-level approval." "It's bigger than I realized," Abigail admitted. "When James first showed me his findings, I thought it was just local corruption engineers taking bribes, perhaps a few regional officials. But this," she shook her head, "no wonder they're so desperate to silence us." "All the more reason to get those documents to someone who can act on them," Wade said. "The federal marshal in Laramie is a good man by all accounts, not easily bought." Abigail studied Wade across the fire, curiosity finally overcoming her reticence. "You never told me why you're doing this," she said softly, "risking your life for a stranger and her cause." Wade was silent for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. Finally, he set aside his coffee cup and met her gaze directly. "My father was a railroad worker," he said, his voice low. "Bridge crew foreman for the Union Pacific during the big expansion. He warned his supervisors about unsafe practices, corners being cut, inferior materials being used. They ignored him." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "Bridge collapsed during a spring flood. 17 men died, including my father." "I'm so sorry," Abigail whispered. "I was 15, Wade continued, "old enough to understand what had happened, young enough to believe justice would be done." A bitter smile touched his lips. "There was an investigation, of course, found that natural forces were to blame. No mention of the warnings, the substandard materials, the rushed construction. Understanding dawned." "That's why you became a soldier," Wade nodded. "Thought if I served my country, protected its people, maybe I could make a difference where my father couldn't." He poked at the fire, sending sparks swirling upward. "Learned eventually that corruption exists everywhere, even in the army. But I also learned that standing up for what's right is never wasted, even when it seems hopeless." "Like standing between a woman and 3 armed men in the snow?" Abigail asked softly. Wade's gaze met hers, something warm kindling in its depths. "Exactly like that." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Abigail found herself moving around the fire toward him, drawn by a connection that had grown stronger with each shared danger. Each revealed confidence. When she settled beside him, shoulders touching, Wade didn't pull away. Instead, he gently took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing circles on her palm. "If things were different," he began hesitantly. "They're not different," Abigail interrupted gently. "They're exactly as they are. And I find I don't wish to change them, except perhaps to remove the men trying to kill us." That startled a laugh from Wade, his face transforming with the genuine smile she had come to treasure. "You are remarkable," he said again, the phrase becoming something of an endearment between them. "So you keep saying," she replied, leaning slightly against his solid warmth. "I'm beginning to think you might be a bit remarkable yourself, Wade Weston." His free hand came up to cup her cheek, turning her face toward his. "Abigail," he murmured, her name a question and a request combined. She answered by closing the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as suppressed feelings found expression at last. His arms encircled her, strong and protective yet infinitely gentle, as if she were something precious he feared to break. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I found you in the snow," he admitted. "I wish you had," Abigail replied, surprising herself with her boldness, though perhaps not with Tucker and his men as an audience. Wade chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly through his chest where her hand rested. No, timing is important for these things. They remained close, talking softly as the fire burned low, sharing stories and hopes that had no place in their daytime flight but found voice in the intimate darkness of the cave. When they finally lay down to sleep, it was in each other's arms, finding comfort and warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or blankets. Morning brought renewed purpose, and somewhat to Abigail's surprise, no awkwardness between them. If anything, the night's revelations had strengthened their partnership, adding depth to their shared determination to reach Laramie. They rode hard through the day, the terrain gradually becoming less steep as they followed the trappers' trail southward. By evening, they had covered impressive ground, though Wade estimated they were still at least a day and a half from Laramie. "Weather's holding," he observed as they made camp in a small grove of trees. "That's in our favor." Abigail nodded, unpacking their dwindling supplies. "Do you think Thornton knows we've changed course?" "Possibly," Wade admitted. "But he can't watch every trail, and this one's obscure enough that we have a good chance of slipping past his men." They ate sparingly, aware that their provisions needed to last until they reached civilization. As night fell, bringing with it plummeting temperatures, they huddled together for warmth, the intimacy between them now natural and comforting. "What will you do?" Wade asked suddenly as they lay looking up at stars visible through the tree branches. "After we reach Laramie, after the documents are safe." Abigail considered the question. Until now, she had thought no further than completing their dangerous mission. "I don't know," she admitted. "My home in Cody holds painful memories now. Boston seems a lifetime away." Wade was silent for a moment. "You could stay," he suggested quietly. "In Wyoming, I mean, start fresh." Abigail turned her head to study his profile in the darkness. "And what would I do in Wyoming, Mr. Weston?" He hesitated, then turned to meet her gaze. "Whatever you want. Write your scientific observations. Teach at the school Eleanor Carson is starting. Help a horse trainer improve his rather sparse cabin." The last was offered with a hint of uncertainty that touched her deeply. "Is that an invitation?" Abigail asked softly. Wade's hand found hers beneath the blanket. "It could be, if you wanted it to be." Abigail's heart raced at the implication. "Wade Weston, are you asking me to consider a future with you?" "I'm asking you to consider the possibility," he clarified, his voice low but steady. "I know it's sudden. I know we've known each other less than a week, but I also know that I've never met anyone like you, Abigail Harlow, and the thought of you leaving once this is over." He trailed off, seemingly unable to find words for the sentiment. Abigail squeezed his hand gently. "I've been thinking the same thing," she confessed. "About what happens after, about not wanting to say goodbye." Relief washed over Wade's features, visible even in the dim light. "So you'll consider it, staying?" "I'll consider it," she promised, though in her heart, she suspected the decision was already made. The connection between them, forged in danger and deepened by shared purpose, had become something neither wished to sever. They sealed this tentative understanding with a kiss that held promise of more to come, once their current peril was behind them. The next day brought them to more populated territory, requiring greater caution as they approached the outskirts of Laramie. They avoided the main roads, taking longer but less traveled routes that Wade knew from his Army days. "The federal marshal's office is near the center of town," Wade explained as they paused on a ridge overlooking the sprawling settlement. "We'll need to enter after dark, avoid being seen if possible." Abigail nodded, studying the town spread below them larger than Cody, with more substantial buildings and the telltale tracks of the railroad cutting through its heart. So close to their destination, yet still so vulnerable. "Do you think Thornton will have men watching here too?" she asked. "Almost certainly," Wade replied grimly. "But they'll be watching the main approaches from the north and west, expecting us to come from Rock Springs. Our approach from the south might give us the advantage of surprise." They waited until dusk began to settle over the landscape before continuing their descent toward Laramie. As the first stars appeared, they reached the outskirts of town, tethering their horses in a small copse of trees before continuing on foot. Wade led the way through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the busier thoroughfares where they might be noticed. Abigail stayed close, the documents secure inside her coat, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear as they neared their goal. The federal marshal's office was a substantial brick building on a corner near the courthouse. Lights burned in the windows, suggesting someone was working late, a stroke of luck they hadn't dared hope for. "Wait here," Wade murmured, positioning Abigail in the shadows of an adjacent building. "Let me make sure it's actually the marshal inside, not someone waiting for us." Abigail nodded, watching anxiously as Wade approached the building with casual confidence, as if he had every right to be there. He disappeared inside, leaving her alone in the darkness, every sense alert for danger. Minutes stretched endlessly. Abigail strained to see through the windows of the marshal's office, but the angle was wrong. Had Wade been captured? Was Thornton himself waiting inside? Should she flee while she still could? Before she could decide, the door opened again and Wade emerged, accompanied by a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Wade gestured toward her hiding place and the older man nodded. "Abigail," Wade called softly, "it's safe. This is Marshal Bennett." Relief flooded through her as she hurried to join them, the documents clutched protectively against her chest. Marshal Bennett's keen eyes assessed her briefly before he ushered them both inside, locking the door behind them. "Mr. Weston tells me you have evidence of serious corruption involving the Northern Pacific Railroad," the marshal said without preamble, gesturing for them to be seated. "And that men have died because of it." "Yes, sir," Abigail replied, placing the oilskin packet on his desk. "My brother, James Harlow, discovered irregularities in the survey reports for a new line. When he investigated further, he found evidence of bribes, falsified safety reports, and misappropriation of government funds." Bennett opened the packet, examining the contents with a practiced eye. His expression grew increasingly grave as he paged through the documents. "This is damning evidence," he said finally, looking up at them. "Names, dates, amounts paid. Your brother was thorough." "James believed in doing things properly," Abigail said, a hint of pride mixing with the grief in her voice. "He wanted everything documented so there could be no question of the truth." The marshal nodded, resealing the packet. "You were right to bring this directly to federal authorities. Local law enforcement wouldn't have the jurisdiction to handle something of this magnitude." "What happens now?" Wade asked. Bennett leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I'll wire my superiors in Washington immediately. These documents will be placed in a secure location until federal agents arrive to escort them back east." His gaze shifted to Abigail. "You'll need to provide formal testimony, of course, and there may be a trial eventually." Abigail nodded, having expected as much. "I'll do whatever is necessary to see justice done for James. In the meantime," the marshal continued, "you'll both need protection. Thornton and his associates won't stop pursuing you just because you've reached my office." "We've noticed," Wade said dryly. Bennett's expression was sympathetic. "I have a safe house on the edge of town where you can stay until arrangements are made for your journey to Washington. It's not fancy, but it's secure and unknown to most locals." The prospect of safety, real safety, not just temporary shelter during their flight, was almost overwhelming to Abigail. For the first time since finding her brother's body, she felt the full weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. Wade must have noticed, for his hand found hers, offering silent support as Marshal Bennett continued outlining the steps that would follow. The conspiracy would be investigated fully, he assured them. Those responsible, regardless of their position or influence, would face justice. "You've done a brave thing, Miss Harlow," Bennett said as he escorted them to a side door that led to a narrow alley. "Your brother would be proud." Tears pricked Abigail's eyes at the simple statement. "Thank you, Marshal." A deputy waited outside with a covered wagon that would transport them inconspicuously to the safe house. As they prepared to depart, Bennett drew Wade aside briefly. Abigail couldn't hear their conversation, but Wade's expression was serious as he nodded in response to whatever the marshal said. The safe house proved to be a modest cabin similar to Wade's in Cody, though more comfortably furnished. "Deputy Miller," A young man with a friendly demeanor but watchful eyes explained that he would remain on guard outside while they rested. Marshal Bennett will send word in the morning about next steps, he assured them before taking up his position on the porch. Alone at last, the reality of their accomplishment began to sink in. The documents were safe. Help was coming. James's killers would face justice. "We made it," Abigail said softly, almost disbelieving. Wade crossed to where she stood by the window, gently turning her to face him. "You made it," he corrected. "Your courage got those documents to safety, Abigail." She shook her head, reaching up to touch his face. "We made it, together, just as you promised." Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, now rough with several days' growth of beard. "I couldn't have done this without you, Wade." His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than you know." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She searched his face, seeing fatigue but also something else, a softness in his expression when he looked at her that made her heart race. "What did Marshal Bennett say to you?" At the end, a slight smile touched Wade's lips. "He said he's seen many brave men in his time as marshal, but few would have undertaken what we just did for a stranger." The smile deepened. "I told him you weren't a stranger to me, not anymore." The simple truth of it resonated between them. In less than a week, they had moved from strangers to allies to something much more profound, a connection forged in shared danger but transcending it entirely. "No," Abigail agreed softly, "not strangers at all." When Wade kissed her this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the certainty of feelings too strong to deny and a future suddenly possible to imagine. In his arms, Abigail found not just safety but belonging, a sense of rightness that defied their brief acquaintance. Later, as they lay together in the small bedroom, Wade's arm a reassuring weight across her waist, Abigail allowed herself to truly contemplate what came next. The investigation would take time. There would be testimony to give, perhaps a trial to attend in Washington, but after that. "I've been considering your proposal," she said quietly into the darkness. Wade stirred beside her. "Have you now?" His voice was warm with affection and something deeper about staying in Wyoming. Abigail turned to face him, though she could barely make out his features in the dim light. "I think I'd like that very much." His hand came up to cradle her face. "Are you sure? It's a hard country, Abigail, different from everything you've known." "I'm sure about you," she replied simply. "The rest we can figure out together." Wade's kiss was answer enough, a promise more binding than words could express. Morning brought a clear, crisp day and news from Marshal Bennett that federal agents would arrive within the week to escort Abigail to Washington. The documents were already secured in the marshal's safe, copies made and dispatched to trusted officials. Preliminary telegrams from Washington suggest this case is being taken very seriously, Bennett informed them when he visited the safe house. The Attorney General himself has expressed interest. The news was validating but also sobering. The higher the officials involved in the corruption, the more dangerous the case became. "What about Thornton?" Wade asked. "Any sign of him in Laramie?" Bennett's expression grew grimmer. "He was seen at the railroad office yesterday, meeting with several men not known to be railroad employees. We're watching him, but without cause for arrest. I can't detain him." "He won't give up," Abigail said, certainty in her voice, "not when the evidence could send him to prison." "Which is why you'll remain here under guard until the federal agents arrive," Bennett assured her. "Deputy Miller will be relieved by Deputy Simmons this afternoon, and I've arranged for additional patrols in this area." After the marshal departed, Wade and Abigail settled into a strange interlude of safety and waiting. For the first time since fleeing her home in Cody, Abigail had the luxury of proper rest, hot meals, and moments of genuine peace. More precious still were the uninterrupted hours with Wade, time to learn each other properly, beyond the immediate demands of survival. They shared stories of their pasts, dreams for the future, building a foundation for what both now acknowledged was something rare and worth preserving. "I sent a telegram to Sheriff Donovan in Cody," Wade told her on their third day in the safe house. "Let him know we're safe and the documents delivered." Abigail nodded, pleased by the thoughtfulness. "Did you ask about your cabin, if it's still standing after Thornton's men searched it?" A smile touched Wade's lips. "Cabin's fine, and apparently Eleanor Carson has been asking after you. Seems you made quite an impression." "I liked her very much," Abigail admitted. "She reminded me a bit of my mother, practical but kind." "She'll be pleased to hear you might be returning permanently," Wade said, watching her face carefully for confirmation. Abigail's smile was answer enough. The decision, tentative just days ago, had solidified in her mind. Whatever happened in Washington, her future lay in Wyoming with the man who had ridden between her and danger, saying simply, "Stop." On the evening of the fourth day, as they sat before the fire discussing their plans for after the investigation, a sharp knock at the door startled them from their comfortable conversation. Wade rose immediately, hand moving to the pistol he kept nearby despite their supposed safety. "Marshal Bennett wouldn't knock like that," he said quietly, "and deputies announced themselves." Abigail tensed, fear returning after days of relative security. "Thornton, stay back," Wade instructed, moving cautiously toward the window that overlooked the porch. Before he reached it, the sound of a brief struggle outside was followed by the door bursting open. Maxwell Thornton himself stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand and two armed men at his shoulders. Behind them, Deputy Simmons lay motionless on the porch steps. "Miss Harlow," Thornton said with cold courtesy, as if they were meeting at a social gathering. "Mr. Weston, I believe we have unfinished business." Wade had his pistol halfway drawn when one of Thornton's men fired, the bullet striking Wade's shoulder and spinning him around. He crashed into a side table, his weapon clattering to the floor as Abigail screamed. "Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," Thornton said, his pistol now aimed directly at Abigail. "All I want are the documents your brother stole. Return them, and perhaps Mr. Weston need not die from his wound." Abigail moved toward Wade, who was struggling to rise, blood seeping through his shirt. "The documents aren't here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "They're with Marshal Bennett." Thornton's expression hardened. "I don't believe you. James Harlow wouldn't have entrusted those papers to anyone but his sister." "Search the house," he ordered his men. As the gunmen began tearing through the cabin, Abigail knelt beside Wade, pressing a cloth against his bleeding shoulder. "Hold on," she whispered. "Help will come." Wade's face was pale with pain, but his eyes were clear. "Behind the stove," he murmured, so softly only she could hear. "My spare pistol, when I create a diversion." Abigail gave a tiny nod of understanding, her mind racing. The safe house was on the outskirts of town, unlikely anyone had heard the shot that struck Wade. Deputy Simmons might be dead or merely unconscious, but either way, he couldn't help them. Their only chance lay in their own actions. Thornton paced impatiently as his men searched, becoming visibly agitated as each hiding place yielded nothing. "Where are they?" he demanded, returning to stand over Abigail and the wounded Wade. "Tell me now, or I start shooting extremities until you cooperate." Wade chose that moment to lunge upward, tackling Thornton despite his injury. The railroad agent's pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as they crashed to the floor. The two gunmen turned at the commotion, momentarily distracted from their search. Abigail seized her opportunity, diving toward the wood stove where Wade had indicated his hidden weapon lay. Her fingers closed around cold metal just as one of Thornton's men noticed her movement. "She's got a gun," he shouted, raising his own weapon. Abigail had never fired a pistol before, but desperation made her actions decisive. She squeezed the trigger, the recoil nearly causing her to drop the weapon. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to make the gunman duck for cover, buying precious seconds. Wade and Thornton were still struggling on the floor, the latter's pristine suit now stained with blood. Whether his own or Wade's was impossible to tell. The second gunman was moving toward Abigail, weapon raised, when the cabin's front window exploded inward in a shower of glass. Federal agents. "Drop your weapons," came a commanding voice from outside. The next moments passed in a blur of action. Men in dark coats swarmed into the cabin, disarming Thornton's hired guns with efficient precision. Wade, bleeding heavily now, was pulled off Thornton by gentle but firm hands. Abigail found herself guided to a chair, the pistol carefully removed from her trembling fingers. "Are you injured, Miss Harlow?" asked a man who introduced himself as Agent Parker. "No, but Wade is," she replied urgently. "He's been shot." A doctor was already attending to Wade, cutting away his bloodied shirt to examine the wound. "Clean through the shoulder," he reported. "Missed anything vital from what I can tell. He'll need stitches and rest, but should recover fully." Relief flooded through Abigail, making her light-headed. Across the room, Thornton was being handcuffed, his face a mask of cold fury as Agent Parker read charges against him: conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, attempted murder. Marshal Bennett received intelligence this afternoon that Thornton was planning something desperate, Parker explained to Abigail as they watched the railroad agent being led away. "We were en route here when we heard the shot." "Deputy Simmons?" Abigail asked, remembering the fallen man. "Concussed but alive," Parker assured her. "He'll have a headache for days, but nothing permanent." The next hours passed in a flurry of activity statements given, wounds tended, arrangements made. Wade was moved to a proper bed after the doctor finished stitching his shoulder, with strict instructions to remain still and allow the injury to begin healing. When the cabin finally emptied of all but one agent posted as guard, Abigail sat beside Wade's bed, holding his uninjured hand in both of hers. "You saved my life," she said softly. Again, Wade's smile was tired but genuine. "Seems to be becoming a habit." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Though I'd appreciate it if we could try some less dangerous activities in the future." Abigail laughed despite herself, tears of relief mingling with the sound. "I'll see what I can arrange," she sobered, studying his pale face. "You frightened me, Wade Weston. Sorry about that." His thumb traced small circles on her palm, a gesture that had become familiar and dear. "Didn't much like the thought of Thornton hurting you. So you let him shoot you instead," Abigail chided gently. "Not exactly how I planned it," Wade admitted, "but it worked out well enough in the end." Abigail leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Rest now. We're safe, truly safe." Wade's eyes were already closing, exhaustion and blood loss taking their toll. "Stay," he murmured, fingers tightening slightly on hers. "Always," Abigail promised, settling into the chair beside his bed as he drifted into healing sleep. The aftermath unfolded with surprising swiftness. Thornton, facing overwhelming evidence and hoping for leniency, provided names of government officials involved in the railroad fraud. Telegrams from Washington confirmed that arrests were already being made in the capital, reaching as high as an assistant secretary in the Department of the Interior. Wade's recovery progressed steadily, though more slowly than he would have liked. By the time federal agents were ready to escort Abigail to Washington for her formal testimony, he was able to sit up and move carefully around the safe house, though the doctor forbade travel for at least another week. "I should stay until you're fully recovered," Abigail insisted as she packed the few belongings she had acquired during their time in Laramie. Wade shook his head, seated in a chair by the window where sunlight illuminated the new lines of pain etched around his eyes. "The sooner you give your testimony, the sooner this will be finished. The sooner you can come home." Home, the word hung between them, laden with promise. "I'll return as quickly as possible," Abigail said, crossing to kneel beside his chair. "Marshal Bennett has arranged for Mrs. Simmons to check on you daily until you're well enough to travel back to Cody." Wade's hand came up to cup her cheek. "I'll be waiting," he said simply, "however long it takes." Their parting was bittersweet, the triumph of having survived and succeeded in their mission, tempered by the uncertainty of separation. As the federal agent's carriage pulled away from the safe house, Abigail looked back to see Wade standing in the doorway, one arm in a sling, the other raised in farewell. The journey to Washington was long but uneventful, a stark contrast to their desperate flight across Wyoming. In the capital, Abigail found herself at the center of a case that had captured national attention. Her testimony, clear and unembellished, was damning to those involved in the conspiracy. James would have been proud, she thought as she stepped down from the witness stand after 3 grueling days of questions. His meticulous documentation, combined with Thornton's cooperation, ensured that justice would be served. "The commission has one final question, Miss Harlow," said the lead investigator as she prepared to depart. "Your brother's service to the public good will not be forgotten. Would you consider a position with the newly formed Interstate Commerce Commission? Your experience and integrity would be most valuable." Abigail was momentarily speechless at the unexpected offer. A prestigious position in Washington, working to prevent exactly the kind of corruption that had claimed James's life, it was the sort of opportunity most women could only dream of. "I'm honored by your offer, sir," she said finally, "but my future lies elsewhere." In her mind's eye, she saw Wade standing in the doorway of the safe house, waiting for her return. "I have commitments in Wyoming that I intend to honor." The investigator looked surprised but nodded respectfully. "The commission's loss, I'm sure. Safe travels, Miss Harlow." 1 month after leaving Laramie, Abigail returned to Wyoming, not to the territorial capital, but to Cody, where a telegram had informed her Wade had returned 2 weeks prior. The stagecoach dropped her at the town's single hotel late in the afternoon, the driver promising to deliver her trunk to its final destination the following morning. "Where might I find Mr. Weston's cabin?" she asked the hotel proprietor, declining his offer of a room for the night. The man smiled knowingly. "Edge of town, follow the creek road about half a mile, can't miss it. Been a fair bit of improvement happening out there lately, folks say." Curious about this last comment, Abigail set out immediately, her heart racing with anticipation as she followed the indicated path. The early evening was mild for late March, spring beginning to assert itself after the harsh winter. She saw the cabin from a distance and understood the proprietor's remark immediately. What had been a modest structure when she'd first glimpsed, it now sported a new porch spanning its front, window boxes waiting for summer flowers, and what appeared to be a small addition being built on one side. As she approached, the sound of hammering ceased, and a familiar figure emerged from around the back of the cabin. Wade froze when he saw her, hammer still in his uninjured hand, his expression transforming from surprise to joy so pure it took her breath away. "Abigail," he said, her name both question and answer as he crossed the distance between them in long strides. She barely had time to set down her small traveling bag before she was in his arms, lifted clear off her feet in an embrace that spoke more eloquently than words of how deeply she had been missed. When he finally set her down, his hands framed her face with gentle reverence. "You're here," he said simply. "You came back." "I promised I would," Abigail replied, her own hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "I see you've been busy." Wade glanced back at the cabin, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "Thought it might need some improvements if you were staying." "If," Abigail echoed, raising an eyebrow, his expression grew serious. "The offer in Washington, was it what you hoped for?" Word traveled quickly, even to the Wyoming frontier. "It was very flattering," she acknowledged. "But I had already made my choice." Relief and something deeper flickered in Wade's eyes. "And that choice is..." Instead of answering directly, Abigail rose on tiptoe to press her lips to his a homecoming more meaningful than any words could express. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, she smiled up at the man who had changed her life by one simple, courageous act in the snow. "My choice is you, Wade Weston, if you'll have me." His answering smile was brighter than the setting sun gilding the Wyoming mountains. "I believe that can be arranged, Miss Harlow." Hand in hand, they walked toward the cabin that was becoming a home, not just a shelter against the wilderness, but a place of belonging, of future, of love that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances, but would endure through all the seasons to come. As twilight settled over Cody, Wyoming, 2 people who had once been strangers stood on a newly built porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Their journey had begun in danger and desperation, but it was ending, or perhaps more accurately, beginning anew in hope and promise. For Abigail Harlow, who had lost everything, and Wade Weston, who had been alone for so long, the simple act of standing together represented a miracle neither had dared expect. That it had started with a chase through the snow, with three men threatening a woman, with a cowboy who rode between them and simply said, "Stop," seemed, in retrospect, exactly as it should have been. Their story, after all, was just beginning.